Lieutenant Sarah Martinez adjusted her Kevlar vest for the 100th time that morning, trying to ignore the stares from the men around her. The forward operating base in Helmand Province buzzed with pre-mission tension, but she could feel the extra weight of skepticism directed her way. At 26, she had fought harder than most to earn her place in the infantry unit, but acceptance remained elusive. "You sure about this, Martinez?" Sergeant Collins asked, not unkindly. His weathered face showed genuine concern rather than malice. "Intel says this one's going to be hot. Maybe you should sit this one out." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had heard variations of this conversation dozens of times since arriving in Afghanistan 3 months ago. The suggestion always came wrapped in protective language, but the message was clear: women didn't belong in combat zones. Her response never wavered. "I'm good to go, Sergeant, just like everyone else." The mission briefing had been straightforward on paper. A routine patrol to investigate reports of Taliban activity in a small village 15 kilometers from base. Intelligence suggested possible weapons caches, but nothing beyond what the unit had handled before. Sarah checked her M4 carbine one final time, running through the familiar ritual that calmed her nerves. Growing up in El Paso, Texas, Sarah had always been drawn to challenges others said she couldn't handle. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had taught her to shoot when she was 12. Her mother, a nurse, had shown her how to patch wounds. Neither parent had discouraged her military ambitions, but they hadn't sugar-coated the reality either. "The military's changing," her father had said the night before she shipped out to basic training. "But change comes slow and hard. You'll have to prove yourself every single day." He had been right. Basic training was brutal for everyone, but Sarah felt the extra scrutiny that came with being one of only 3 women in her company. Every mistake was magnified, every success questioned. When she graduated at the top of her class in marksmanship, some attributed it to luck. When she excelled in tactical exercises, others suggested the instructors were going easy on her. The ride to the village was tense, but uneventful. Sarah sat wedged between Private Johnson and Corporal Williams in the back of the Humvee, her gear rattling with each bump in the road. The landscape outside was desolate, all brown dirt and sparse vegetation under a blazing sun that turned the vehicle into an oven. "First real action, Martinez?" Williams asked. His tone was neutral, but Sarah detected a hint of condescension. "No," she replied simply. She had been on several patrols already, though none had resulted in significant contact with enemy forces. Each mission had ended with the same debriefing questions about her performance, the same careful evaluation of whether she had what it took. The village appeared through the dust like a mirage. Mud brick houses clustered around a central well, with narrow alleys snaking between them. Children played in the dirt, while women in burqas watched from doorways. It looked peaceful, almost sleepy in the afternoon heat. That assessment changed the moment the convoy entered the village proper. The first shot came from a rooftop to their left, the sharp crack of an AK-47 cutting through the engine noise. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She identified the muzzle flash, called out the position, and returned fire in one fluid motion. Around her, the rest of the unit responded with similar precision. "Contact left. Rooftop 2 o'clock." Sergeant Collins shouted into his radio. The firefight escalated quickly. What had seemed like a single sniper revealed itself as a coordinated ambush. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions, forcing the convoy to halt and take defensive positions. Sarah rolled out of the Humvee and found cover behind a low wall, her heart hammering but her hands steady. This was what she had trained for. All the doubt, all the questioning, all the suggestions that she wasn't built for this moment. None of it mattered now. There was only the immediate tactical situation and the lives of her fellow soldiers. A Taliban fighter appeared in a window across the street, rifle raised. Sarah's shot took him center mass before he could fire. No hesitation, no second guessing. Just clean, effective soldiering. "Good shot," Johnson called from somewhere to her right. The acknowledgement meant more than he probably realized. For the first time since arriving in theater, Sarah felt like she was being judged purely on her performance rather than her gender. The engagement continued for 43 minutes. By the time reinforcements arrived and the surviving Taliban fighters melted away into the surrounding countryside, Sarah had expended 4 magazines and confirmed 3 kills. More importantly, none of her unit had been seriously wounded. During the debrief back at base, Colonel Henderson reviewed each soldier's performance with his usual methodical precision. When he reached Sarah's actions, his assessment was brief but significant. Outstanding fire discipline and target acquisition. Textbook engagement. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. They represented the kind of professional recognition Sarah had been fighting to earn. But even as she felt a surge of satisfaction, she knew this was just one battle in a longer war for acceptance. Later that evening, as she cleaned her weapon in the armory, Sergeant Collins approached her workstation. His expression was thoughtful, lacking the protective concern from that morning. "You did good out there today, Martinez." "Real good. Thank you, Sergeant. I'm not saying this because you're a woman," he continued. "I'm saying it because you're a soldier. And today you proved what kind of soldier you are." It was progress, but Sarah understood it was fragile progress. One successful engagement didn't erase months of doubt or change institutional attitudes overnight. She would have to prove herself again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day following. What she couldn't know as she methodically reassembled her rifle was that her biggest test still lay ahead. The mission that would either cement her reputation or destroy it was already being planned in the operations tent. Intelligence reports were painting a picture of increased Taliban activity in their sector, and her unit was being tasked with a more aggressive response. As she headed to her bunk that night, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline that followed combat. Her body ached, her ears still rang slightly from the gunfire, but her confidence had grown. She belonged here. She had proved it to others, and, more importantly, she had proved it to herself. The base settled into its nighttime rhythm around her. Guard posts were manned, equipment was secured, and soldiers found what rest they could. In a few hours, they would wake to another day of uncertainty, another chance to test their skills and courage against an enemy that showed no mercy to anyone, regardless of gender. Sarah closed her eyes and let sleep take her, unaware that her next mission would push her far beyond anything she had yet experienced. The Taliban had taken notice of the effective American soldier who had disrupted their ambush, and they were planning accordingly. Her reputation as a competent warrior was about to be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. 3 weeks after the village firefight, intelligence reports indicated a significant Taliban presence gathering in a remote valley 40 kilometers northeast of the base. Satellite imagery showed unusual movement patterns, and intercepted communications suggested a major weapons shipment was being prepared for distribution to cells throughout the region. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez studied the mission briefing with growing unease. This wasn't a routine patrol or a quick strike operation. The intelligence painted a picture of a heavily fortified position with an estimated 30 to 40 fighters. Her 12-person unit would be inserted by helicopter at dawn, tasked with disrupting the operation and gathering intelligence on the broader network. "This is a significant escalation," Captain Roberts explained to the assembled soldiers. "Command believes this cell is responsible for the increased IED activity along Highway 7. We shut them down, we save American lives." Sarah nodded along with the others, but privately she wondered if this mission was being assigned to their unit as a test of her performance after the village engagement. The timing felt suspicious, coming so soon after her first successful combat action. The pre-dawn insertion went smoothly. 2 Black Hawks dropped the unit at a landing zone 3 kilometers from the target, disappearing into the darkness with barely a whisper. The team moved through the rocky terrain with practiced silence, each soldier focused on their assigned sector of responsibility. Sarah carried the radio in addition to her standard loadout, a responsibility that reflected growing trust from Sergeant Collins. The weight of communication gear added 15 pounds to her pack, but she welcomed the extra duty. It meant she was being treated as a full member of the team rather than a liability to be protected. The target compound sat in a narrow valley between two ridgelines, exactly as the satellite photos had shown. But something felt wrong as they approached. The intelligence had suggested a bustling operation, but the compound appeared almost deserted in the pre-dawn gloom. "Too quiet," muttered Corporal Williams over the radio. He was positioned on the north ridge with a clear view of the main building. Sergeant Collins made the decision to proceed anyway. Intelligence was never perfect, and the mission parameters called for investigation even if the immediate threat appeared reduced. The team moved into position for a coordinated approach to the compound. The trap was sprung with devastating precision. Taliban fighters emerged from concealed positions that hadn't appeared in any reconnaissance photos. They had clearly been watching and waiting, allowing the American soldiers to move deep into the valley before revealing themselves. Sarah's unit found itself caught in a crossfire from elevated positions on three sides. "Ambush! Ambush! Take cover!" Collins shouted into his radio, but his words were nearly drowned out by the sudden eruption of automatic weapons fire. Sarah dove behind a boulder as bullets sparked off the rocks around her. Her training took over immediately, even as her mind processed the tactical nightmare they faced. The Taliban had superior numbers, better positions, and the element of surprise. Everything about the situation violated basic military doctrine about favorable engagement conditions. "Command, this is Bravo 2-6, she called in her radio. "We are under heavy fire at grid coordinates 4-1-7-8-5-2. Request immediate close air support and medical evacuation standby." The response crackled back through heavy static. "Bravo 2-6, negative on immediate air support. Weather conditions have grounded all aircraft. You are on your own for now." Sarah's stomach dropped. Without air support, their chances of fighting out of this position were minimal. She relayed the information to Sergeant Collins, who responded with a string of profanity that would have impressed drill instructors back at Fort Benning. The firefight intensified over the next 20 minutes. Taliban fighters moved through the rocks above them with disturbing coordination, maintaining constant pressure while staying mobile enough to avoid effective return fire. Sarah had already gone through 2 magazines, but her targets remained frustratingly elusive. "Martinez," Collins called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "We need a call for artillery support. Grid coordinates for a fire mission." Sarah consulted her map and GPS unit, calculating firing solutions while bullets continued to snap overhead. Artillery was a dangerous option given their position, but it might be their only chance to break up the enemy positions long enough to extract. She was in the middle of calling in the fire mission when the first bullet found her. The impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. The round caught her in the left shoulder, spinning her around and slamming her into the boulder she had been using for cover. Pain exploded through her upper body, but her training kicked in immediately. She pressed herself against the rock and assessed the damage. Blood soaked through her uniform, but her arms still functioned. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major arteries. Painful, but not immediately life-threatening. She tore open a pressure bandage with her teeth and applied it one-handed while continuing to monitor the radio. "Martinez is hit." Johnson called out from his position. "How bad?" "Still functional," she replied through gritted teeth. "Continuing mission." The artillery strike came in 3 minutes later, walking high explosive rounds across the ridgeline where the heaviest enemy fire originated. The effect was immediate and devastating. Taliban fighters scrambled for new positions, and the coordinated nature of their attack began to break down. Sarah seized the opportunity to call in a medical evacuation helicopter, providing detailed coordinates and landing zone information despite the continued sporadic gunfire. Her shoulder throbbed with each movement, but she maintained her professional composure. The second bullet hit her while she was coordinating the evacuation. This one caught her in the right leg, just above the knee. The impact dropped her to the ground, and this time the pain was accompanied by the sick knowledge that the wound was more serious. She could feel the bone, intact but damaged, and blood flowed freely despite her immediate first aid efforts. "Martinez is down," Williams shouted. "Still good," she called back, though her voice was strained now. Still in the fight. She wasn't lying exactly. She could still operate the radio, still provide fire support with a rifle, still function as a soldier. But movement was becoming increasingly difficult, and she could feel the effects of blood loss beginning to set in. The third bullet found her 10 minutes later, as she was directing the incoming medical helicopter to a safe landing zone. It struck her in the left side, below the ribs, and this time she knew immediately that she was in serious trouble. The pain was different now, deeper and more frightening. She could taste blood in her mouth, and breathing had become labored. Still, she continued working the radio, guiding the helicopter pilot through the maze of enemy fire and rocky terrain. "Dustoff 7-2, this is Bravo 2-6. Be advised, landing zone is still taking intermittent fire. Recommend approach from the southeast to minimize exposure." Her voice was weaker now, but still clear and professional. The helicopter pilot acknowledged her instructions and began his approach, using the terrain features she had identified to mask his flight path. The fourth bullet came as the helicopter touched down. It hit her in the right arm this time, shattering her radius and making it nearly impossible to hold the radio handset. Blood loss was becoming critical, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each heartbeat. But the helicopter was on the ground, and her wounded teammates needed to reach it safely. "Go, go, go," she heard Sergeant Collins shouting. Sarah watched through blurring vision as her fellow soldiers moved toward the helicopter, some carrying wounded comrades, others providing covering fire. She tried to stand, to move toward the aircraft herself, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. The fifth bullet was the one that should have killed her. It struck her in the chest, just below the collarbone, missing her heart by less than 2 inches. The impact drove her back against the boulder, and for a moment everything went gray around the edges. She could feel her life slipping away, could sense her body beginning the process of shutting down. But somehow, impossibly, she remained conscious. The radio handset lay beside her in the dirt, and she could hear the helicopter pilot calling for status updates. With enormous effort, she reached for it with her one functional hand. "Dustoff 7-2, she whispered into the radio. "All personnel accounted for. You're clear for takeoff." Strong hands grabbed her then, lifting her toward the helicopter. She recognized Johnson's voice, though his words seemed to come from very far away. "Not leaving you behind, Martinez. Not today." As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah caught a glimpse of the battlefield below. Taliban fighters were already moving into the positions her unit had vacated, but the immediate threat was over. The mission had been completed, intelligence had been gathered, and, most importantly, all American soldiers were accounted for. She closed her eyes as the aircraft banked toward the base, feeling the steady vibration of the rotors and the professional efficiency of the flight medic working over her. Consciousness came and went in waves, but she held on to one clear thought. She had done her job. Despite everything, despite the pain and the blood and the near-certain death, she had remained a soldier until the end. The base hospital rushed toward them through the clear morning air, and Sarah allowed herself to hope that she might actually survive this. But even if she didn't, even if these were her final moments, she had proved something important. Not just to her unit or her commanding officers, but to everyone who had ever suggested that women weren't built for combat. The bright lights of the field hospital burned through Sarah's eyelids as consciousness slowly returned. Machines beeped steadily around her, and she could feel the strange disconnection that came with powerful pain medication. Her first attempt at movement sent waves of agony through multiple parts of her body, reminding her immediately of what had happened. 5 bullets. Somehow she had survived 5 bullets. "Easy there, Lieutenant," The voice belonged to Major Catherine Webb, the chief medical officer at the base. "You've been out for 18 hours. We had to perform some pretty extensive surgery." Sarah tried to speak, but found her throat raw and dry. A cup of ice chips appeared, and she managed a few grateful sips before attempting words again. "My unit, everyone made it back. Private Johnson has a broken arm. Corporal Williams took shrapnel in his leg, but nothing life-threatening. You took the worst of it." The relief was overwhelming. Despite her own injuries, knowing that her fellow soldiers had survived made everything else bearable. She had done her job, kept the radio operational, guided them to safety. The cost had been steep, but not unbearable. Over the following days, as Sarah began the long process of recovery, the story of her actions during the ambush spread throughout the base. The official after-action report praised her exceptional courage under fire and steadfast commitment to mission completion despite severe wounds. But it was the unofficial accounts from her fellow soldiers that carried the real impact. Sergeant Collins visited her on the third day, looking uncomfortable in the sterile medical environment, but determined to say his piece. "I owe you an apology, Martinez," he began without preamble. "I spent months thinking you might be a liability in combat. Turns out you're one of the finest soldiers I've ever served with." "Thank you, Sergeant. That means a lot." "It's more than that," he continued. "What you did out there, staying on that radio despite everything, calling in the helicopter, making sure everyone got out safe, that's the kind of leadership the Army needs. Gender doesn't have anything to do with it." Similar conversations happened throughout her recovery period. Soldiers she had served with, medical staff treating her wounds, even officers from other units stopped by to pay their respects. Each interaction chipped away at the institutional skepticism that had surrounded her deployment to a combat role. But perhaps the most meaningful conversation came from an unexpected source. Colonel Henderson, the battalion commander, arrived on her 5th day in the hospital. Sarah struggled to sit up straighter, but he waved her back down. "At ease, Lieutenant. I'm not here for a formal visit." He pulled up a chair beside her bed, his expression serious but not unkind. "I want to talk to you about something that's been bothering me since I read the after-action reports. Do you know why your unit was assigned that particular mission?" Sarah had wondered about this herself, but she kept her expression neutral. "No, sir. There are 3 other units that could have handled it. Units with more experience in that terrain, better suited for the intelligence requirements. But I specifically requested that your team be assigned." The confession hung in the air between them. Sarah felt a familiar anger rising, but forced herself to remain calm. "May I ask why, sir?" Henderson's expression was uncomfortable, but honest. "Because I wanted to see how you would perform under extreme pressure. There had been questions about whether women could handle frontline combat roles. I thought a difficult mission would provide a definitive answer." "And what answer did you get, sir?" "The answer that I should have known from the beginning. That courage and competence have nothing to do with gender. That I nearly got a good soldier killed because of my own prejudices." The apology was more than Sarah had expected, but she wasn't sure how to respond. Part of her was angry at being used as a test case. Another part was grateful for the honesty. "What happens now, sir?" "Now you recover, and when you're ready, you return to duty. But I want you to know that your actions out there have changed minds at levels far above this base. The Pentagon is watching, Congress is asking questions, and women throughout the military are citing your example." It was both gratifying and daunting to realize the broader implications of her survival. She had wanted to be judged as an individual soldier, but circumstances had made her a symbol of something larger. The recovery process was brutal. Multiple surgeries to repair damaged organs, months of physical therapy to regain use of her injured limbs, and ongoing treatment for the psychological effects of trauma. But Sarah approached rehabilitation with the same determined focus she had brought to her military training. Her parents flew out to visit during the 2nd week, their faces showing the strain of nearly losing their daughter. Her mother's nurse training kicked in immediately, asking detailed questions about her treatment and prognosis. Her father was quieter, but Sarah could see the pride in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she told them during one of their visits. "I know this isn't what you wanted for me." Her father shook his head firmly. "Don't you dare apologize. You did something important out there. You proved something that needed proving." "At what cost, though? Look at me." "I am looking at you," her mother said softly. "I'm looking at my daughter who saved 11 soldiers' lives while taking 5 bullets. I'm looking at someone who changed history." The phrase, "changed history," felt too grand, but Sarah was beginning to understand that her survival had implications beyond her personal experience. Letters arrived from women throughout the military, thanking her for opening doors and challenging assumptions. Congressional representatives requested meetings to discuss policy changes regarding women in combat roles. Most significantly, the Secretary of Defense announced new guidelines for gender integration in frontline units, citing recent combat experiences as evidence that previous restrictions were no longer justified. Sarah's name wasn't mentioned specifically in the announcement, but everyone understood the connection. Physical therapy was a daily battle against pain and limitation. The bullet wounds had healed, but the damage to muscles, nerves, and bone required careful rebuilding. Some days, simple tasks like buttoning her uniform or holding a coffee cup felt impossibly difficult. But she persevered, driven by the knowledge that her recovery was being watched by people who still questioned whether women belonged in combat. Every small victory in rehabilitation felt like a victory for female soldiers everywhere. 6 months after the ambush, Sarah was cleared for limited duty. She couldn't return to frontline combat roles immediately. The physical limitations were still too significant, but she was assigned to training new recruits. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had gone from fighting to prove women could serve in combat, to teaching others how to do it. Her first class included both male and female recruits, and Sarah could see the skepticism in some faces when they learned about her injuries. But as she began teaching tactical procedures, weapons handling, and crisis management, that skepticism transformed into respect. "The most important thing I can teach you," she told them during one session, "is that in combat, there are only 2 types of soldiers: those who do their job and those who don't. Everything else is irrelevant." A young female recruit raised her hand. "What was it like getting shot 5 times?" Sarah considered the question carefully. It was one she had been asked dozens of times in different forms. "It hurt," she answered honestly. "But the physical pain wasn't the worst part. The worst part was thinking I might let my team down, that I might not be able to complete the mission. Everything else was just details." The honesty seemed to resonate with the recruits. These young soldiers, both male and female, were inheriting a military that was more accepting of gender integration than the one Sarah had entered. Her experience had helped create that change. A year later, Sarah received orders for a new assignment. She was being promoted to captain and given command of a training unit focused on preparing mixed-gender teams for deployment. It was recognition of both her combat experience and her role in advancing military integration. On her last day at the base, where she had nearly died, Sarah walked through the medical facility where she had spent so many months recovering. The staff greeted her warmly, proud of their most famous patient's progress. She stopped at the memorial wall in the main lobby, where photographs honored soldiers who had died in service. Her name wasn't there, obviously, but she thought about how easily it could have been. 5 bullets should have been enough to kill anyone. Instead, she was alive, promoted, and assigned to shape the next generation of soldiers. The skeptics who had questioned women's place in combat were largely silent now, their arguments undermined by her example and the examples of other female soldiers who had followed. As she prepared to leave for her new assignment, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had enlisted to serve her country and prove herself as a soldier. She had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations, but the cost had been higher than she could have imagined. The 5 bullets had taken their toll. She would always carry physical limitations from her wounds, and the psychological effects of trauma required ongoing attention. But they had also given her something unexpected, a platform to advocate for change and the credibility to be heard. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had survived 5 bullets and proved that women belonged on the front lines. Captain Sarah Martinez would spend the rest of her career ensuring that future female soldiers wouldn't have to fight the same battles for acceptance that she had faced. The war for equality in military service wasn't over, but her survival had won a crucial battle in that larger conflict. The doubters had been wrong. Women were meant for the front lines, just like men. They were meant to serve, to sacrifice, and, when necessary, to take 5 bullets and keep fighting until the mission was complete.